Hi, my beautiful listeners. We've had a little bit of difficulty with Facebook. So thanks to Nate and trying to get that all worked out, my beautiful producer. It will be posted up later, but right now it's just going to be audio. And so let's go ahead and get started. On the last program, I introduced Stephen Sakellarios in part one, In Another Life, proving reincarnation. On this program, we kind of went over what reincarnation is, why it's important, how Stephen got involved in it. And Stephen's been working for about 20 years to bring accurate information about reincarnation to the public. But you guys, he's not the first person who has embraced this concept, putting their lives, their careers, their sanity, their reputation at risk. This was a subject, you guys, and it still is a taboo subject. And when I bring Stephen on, I want to talk to him a little bit about why it is not widely accepted in Western culture or our Western hemisphere here. Going into the first book that I read regarding reincarnation was Dr. Brian Weiss, who wrote Many Lives, Many Masters. It was a story about him, not even a story, it was a real life encounter of 84 past lives of Catherine. And this man was a Yale University graduate. He was the head of psychiatry at Mount Sinai, brilliant man. Another New York Times best-selling book was also a book that I absolutely loved as well. It was called Soul Survivor. This was about a 2-year-old boy who was screaming in the middle of the night, plane on fire, little man can't get out. What would you do if you were his parents? So they took a risk. They wanted to get to the bottom of this. Hi, everybody. We're on Facebook now. Thank you, Nate. I'm going over you all just some of, before I introduce Stephen to you, some of the major works that have been done and have been recognized on the New York Times bestseller list. And Nate, if you can put this up, I would love it. The Many Lives, Many Masters. Just to let you all know that Stephen isn't coming from left field. This is, when you hear him speak, he is a very educated, wise, well-written, well-spoken man, just like these authors, these people who have risked their lives and have risked their reputations to talk about a subject that's very taboo, but can also bring so much healing. The first Many Lives, Many Masters is written by Dr. Brian Weiss, a Yale graduate, my followers, my friends, my family. He was able to go back 84 lives with one of his patients to get to issues that were concerning her. And they were not threatening her life, but they were inhibiting her life until they were able to go back and realize where some of these issues had come from. And another well-written book, you all may have heard of this as well, and Nate, if you can pop this one up, is Soul Survivor. This little boy, 2 years old, screaming out in nightmares and plane on fire, little man can't get out. His parents didn't know what to do. What was it? What it ended up being was their son was living the life of James Houston, a World War II fighter pilot who was killed in the battle for Iwo Jima, over 60 years now. And in Soul Survivor, readers will come to know and believe, I love this, so I have to read it, in the special child who harbors the soul of a man who died in 1945. These people were willing to come forth and share this experience, no matter how crazy, woo-woo, whatever you call it, is out there, you guys. And my special guest, Stephen Sakellarios, is no different. A well-read man, a well-authored man, well-written, and speaks beautifully. And with that, I want to introduce Stephen Sakellarios. Welcome, Stephen, to my program, to Beyond Proof.
Hi, Angie. Thank you for inviting me again.
Yes, again. And I want to start with Stephen, your book, Reincarnation Can Be Proven. This book that you wrote, was this a summary of the books that you've written in the past regarding Mathew Franklin Whittier?
Yeah, and one of the reasons I wrote it was that the ebooks were a bit hefty, and I think people didn't like ebooks very much. And there were any number of reasons I thought, well, why aren't these selling? And so I decided I was going to address all the problems all at the same time, which is to say, a print book that's small, it has a punchy cover, and a punchy title, and let's see how that does. So we'll see. I was gonna
Excellent.
I was gonna say I like what you said about risking my career and reputation and sanity. I say my career took a hit, my reputation took a hit, and the audience can decide about the sanity part
And
themselves.
I think we've all got to be a little insane. But you know what? And this, you know what, Stephen, talk about this just a little bit. I know it's going off course a little, but okay, why? Because I will tell you, every religion believed in some sort of reincarnation, correct?
Yeah, the esoteric side, the initial, yeah, among the intimate disciples, I think it was understood. But you can even see that in the New Testament, because they asked Jesus, why was this man born blind? Was it his parents, or did he sin? In other words, did he sin or did his parents sin? Which is to say, is it karma or genetics, whatever it is passed down, or did he do something? Well, they don't mean he sinned in the womb. They mean in a past life. It's clearly inferred that the disciples understood reincarnation. They understood it so well, it wasn't even worth debating. See?
So why do you think that the religions took this main component out of our belief system and made it now seem woo-woo and taboo and witchcraft and witchery, and it's got such a negative connotation?
Well,
Power?
that was a power play
Yeah,
by emperors and governments, and people in power that did that. And there's some speculation that it was easier to control the people if they, took it out, and people thought there was only one lifetime, and their, whether they avoided hell or not depended on the priests, on authorities, and it was a lot
right,
easier to control people. That's one theory, but I can't get in their mind and say for sure why they did it. But
right,
clearly, what happens is that the esoteric view, which is the same perennial philosophy that's been taught down through the ages, is too powerful for ordinary people. It requires
right.
too much personal transformation. They can't assimilate it. So it has to be watered down for the masses somehow or other.
Right. And you have done a beautiful job. Is it right? Was it the Mathew Franklin Whittier, which we'll get into, and you can explain to us who this person is, because when you all hear about him, I'm very curious as how he crept into into your body. It's going to be it'll be very
Yeah.
interesting. But my question, is it true that the first, because I didn't get a chance to look at it, the in his own world, in his own words, in his own world, were those like 3,000 pages of just
Combined, yeah. It's
wow?
all evidence. And what happened
Yes,
was I set out to write. When I first started the first book, I remember thinking to myself, well, I've hit 200 pages, so at least it's going to be big enough,
right,
And that, because when you look up Mathew Franklin Whittier, who was the younger brother of the poet John Greenleaf Whittier, you can't find very much on him, very
right,
little. And then what you find on him, is marginalized, and it's not a very favorable picture of him. But there's not very much. He's only supposed to have written one series that was about maybe 70 pieces over the course of his life.
right.
I found at the end, I found 2,100 pieces he wrote in all genres, you know, dozens, if not hundreds, of different pseudonyms. All of it was anonymous. And his whole life unfolded. The more I dug, the more I found, to the point where I just had to keep adding things.
So let's back up. First of all, you mentioned that you have done rigorous, like methods, your methodology. You didn't just start and all of a sudden this Mathew Franklin Whittier just popped in. What was the impetus for you starting your research into reincarnation?
Well, that started when back in 1997, when I decided to do a documentary on that subject. And it was just a case where I started a little video company, and I knew that people that go into business lose their creative edge, and I wanted to keep some creative project running parallel with it. So I just woke up one morning, I knew that was the topic. So that's how that got started. But see, I had studied reincarnation in Eastern philosophy for years, since I was like 19 or so, but I didn't know that any research was being done in Western world and Western society until I started this documentary. I started researching, and then I found Dr. Ian Stevenson and his work with children, and I found Peter Ramster, who uses Australia and uses hypnosis rather in Australia. And I found people like myself trying to prove their own past lives. And I also found out about past life therapy, and some of those cases were very strong, like James the Submarine Man, Bruce Kelly. The therapist was Rick Brown, I believe. That's a very strong case. And the one that you mentioned with James Leininger. So, and Dr. Weiss, so there's a lot of work that's been done. And once I started poking into that, I learned the method, the methods that were used. And when I released my documentary in 2003, I gave an interview. And in that interview, the lady asked me, this was like an emailed interview. She asked me if I remembered any of my past lives. And one of them, I don't have the quote in front of me, but one of them was basically a description of Matthew's life before I ever found out about him. A writer, uh, one of among the romantic poets, but not one of the famous ones, but still kind of in the periphery in that circle, And so 2 years later, I was poking around the internet looking for the names of female writers, because that's what a psychic had told me, that I'd been a female writer on the West Coast around 1930. And I found this website for Sarah Orne Jewett, who was in Boston. She was one of the romantic writers in the late 1800s. We've got an image of the picture of Mathew that I first saw on that website. It should be, let's see, MFW on Jewett website, if we've got that. That's what I saw. When I got into that website, I sent a message to a friend of mine who was kind of psychic, and I said, I feel this is very familiar. There's something about Sarah Orne Jewett that I feel. I don't think I've ever read about her. And he sent back the link to this page. And as soon as I looked at that image of him and looked into the eyes, I said, "This is me." I felt that.
There
So
is a huge resemblance, by the way.
yeah, it's very similar. We have a comparison picture up here too. MFW. Uh, let's see. No, it's anyway. You got it. Okay, very good. All right.
Excellent.
So
Thanks, Nate.
yeah, so it's very similar, except that the end of the nose is a little different. And Mathew made fun of his nose quite a bit. So Nate, I'm seeing your screen, by the way, for what it's worth. So he had this bulbous tip on the end of his nose, and it was a little longer, and he used to make fun of that. But when I saw that, I had the feeling that he used to kind of, when he was deep in thought, he would rub the tip of his nose with his, like that with his thumb and
Yes.
forefinger, wanting us
Yep.
unconsciously wanting to get rid of it. See, so I think
Right.
he did get rid of it. So
Oh my
apparently if there's something
gosh.
you don't like, maybe you can get rid of that next time.
Yeah,
The other, the,
another, what is that called? Psychokinesis. Being
Something like
able
that.
to
Yeah, I mean, because that's really if you look at the picture, that's really the only difference, especially that comparison picture. I was mid-30s and Mathew is mid-40s, so pretty
So
similar.
in 2005, then you're doing the research, you're noticing, and there's some resemblance or whatever. Okay, so at that point, Stephen, how did you start going down the path of researching him? Was it just a feeling at first? Was it a nudge that just led you
Oh,
to
it was really
keep?
powerful. No, I
Yeah.
knew. I didn't really start researching it in earnest for about 4 years, but I knew it immediately as soon as I saw that. So what I did is I got information on John Greenleaf Whittier and read what little you could find out about Mathew. And I found out that he wrote some satirical character, kind of like Archie Bunker, which he called Ethan Spike. And I found all of those. As soon as I got, there's one biography about him. It's a student thesis. I got hold of that. And on the back of that is about 4 or 5 of these Ethan Spike satirical pieces. And as soon as I got hold of them and looked at them, it came to me very strongly. I said, he used to embed a great deal of his own personal life in code in these things, and that turned out to be true with bells on. I mean, he really, everybody writes from their own experience, but he would secretly embed these intimate details of his life, especially his first wife Abby, who was his soulmate. Their whole story is in all of these seemingly humorous pieces. So I
Right.
was able to get what amounted to an entire autobiography out of that. Plus he wrote travel logs, and those are basically published diaries, so there's a lot of information in that as well.
Wow. Okay. What are you saying? We are going to skip a break. Oh, good, you guys. So we go into normal light. Thank you, Nate. So
Okay.
is that okay with you, Stephen? We're
Yep,
going to
yep,
skip a break
that's good.
here. Okay. And before we go on, I want to, Stephen, if you can share, because you've got such extensive research and you guys out there watching and following. This man has given so much documented proof, and his website is just jam packed with just such it's complimentary information. If you have an interest in reincarnation and following, this is one of the longest, most extensive research studies, I think, right, Stephen,
I would
into
say I would
reincarnation.
say it's the most deeply
Yep.
researched. But yeah, it's not
And so
necessarily the strongest case, but it was, because there's a lot of cases out there like the Leininger case that are pretty hard to argue with.
well, and then too, you all, this is very interesting too, is we were discussing Dr. Ian Stevenson's work, and he died unfortunately in 1970. But he actually traveled the world for 40 years, and 3,000 children's cases of past lives, and these children being able to bring up. And so this is not a new subject. This is something that people have been studying. I'm so honored to have you on my program,
Thank
Stephen,
you.
to bring it to the awareness and to the forefront of this. I mean, in a way, consciousness. And so, Stephen, can you tell my audience where can they find you? How do they get a hold of you?
Well, we've got a website which you may be able to flash up there, but it's www.ial.goldthread.com. And everything is there. My email is there. I had to make it, non-clickable, because I was getting too much spam, but it's written out there, and anyone's free to contact me, of course.
Excellent. And
Yep.
so let's start up again then to what we were talking about your research. Um, so who was Mathew Franklin Whittier? Who was he? Not in association to John Greenleaf, but I mean, who was Mathew Franklin Whittier? And are
Yeah.
you glad that you are like his reincarnation?
Yeah. Yeah. He was he was a philosopher, and he was a writer. He became a mystic because his wife Abby taught him mysticism. It appears that she learned it from her mother, who was Scottish, and she taught it to him when she was quite young. She became his tutor. This is all things I figured out, and can't get into the proof of it because nobody knows this story. But when she was quite young, she began tutoring him because he couldn't get an education. He couldn't get his father to agree to send him to college like his older brother. So he ran away from home at age 12. At that time, he was already publishing in a major Boston newspaper, the New England Galaxy. He began publishing in uh, let's see, it's the Advocate, New York City Advocate, I think it is. I don't have the name exactly right, in New York City, and also in another paper in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. So already at age 12, he was publishing. So he ran away from home. He spent some of his time in New York City, some of his time in Boston, and went from there. By age 16, he was editing a paper up in New York City and helping his brother get a leg up by republishing his brother's poetry there. But he became deeply involved in the abolitionist movement, especially when Abby convinced him of that. Before then, he, being a Quaker, he was in favor of the colonization solution, which meant sending slaves back to Africa. And the reason he was in favor of that was because he was afraid of a bloodbath if the abolitionists incited slave insurrections. But Abby convinced him that, there was no use in waiting, that it was a travesty and it needed to be directly addressed, and it needed to be stopped. So he was associated with William Lloyd Garrison, who was quite radical. Abby convinced him of the abolitionist position. He was involved, or at least connected with people in the Underground Railroad. So he kept a very, very low profile. Even when his works, he published everything anonymously, almost everything. And even when his works were plagiarized or somebody else took claim for them, or somebody else said that they were written by another person, he couldn't come out and fight that, because he couldn't come into the public eye. He couldn't come into public scrutiny, because all those people were operating the Underground Railroad. See, he was connected to all those people. It would be life and death for them. So he was a very secretive person, and brilliant, I think. I can write like him. I've done it a few times just to see if I can do it, a humorous story and a piece of poetry. But he was like one of these people that just sparked off ideas, and then other people would jump in and, like a feeding frenzy, and kind of run with it and steal them and use them and imitate him and everything else. But he was like the idea man. His personality was more mercurial than mine was, and maybe a little less mature, and maybe to begin with a little cockier, but he could just fire off these brand new ideas, and he'd get bored and start something else. Meanwhile, all his imitators were busy milking the first thing dry, and he was already on to something else. He was a
Right.
deeply ethical and moral person, and he strove his whole life to use his talent for social reforms. Things
Wow.
like to eliminate debtor's prison. He wrote a book about that. To eliminate slavery, and many other things. So he really dedicated all of his work to trying to better society, but he kept out of sight.
So do you think his soul then picked you
Oh no, it's
in
me. It's just me.
it's you?
It's just like it was me at age 14 or age, 5 or age
Interesting.
30. There's only one life. See, that's the problem. And you're not that different. This is what I think is fascinating about my study, is because I have things I wrote and I have a lot of things Mathew wrote. I can compare those
Right.
things, and I can show that certain things change. The physical personality is a little different, as I said. I may or may not be quite as smart as he was. I don't know. Not certainly not in the all-rounder sense, because I know he could do math and I couldn't. But
I told my son, I said, "You know what?" I said, "I love you. I'll help you in any way I can, but I'm out at 5th grade math."
yeah, I'm at least maybe even before that. So, but he could do math, but the higher mind is exactly the same, and I can show it. I can demonstrate it, which means his sense of humor, the way his mind works, his values, his attitudes. And I can read his writing, and it's exactly the way I would put it. And I can even anticipate, I can also feel what he really, really liked. When he hit, anybody like a musician or somebody that's composing music, and there's just, or a photographer, because I was into photography. If you get a shot that you really, really, think this one really works, I can tell when Mathew felt that way about his writing. And I can predict that he would reuse those things. And in fact, he would. So it's the same person. The only difference is I have a different body, and I have amnesia, which means I cannot remember from that lifetime, just like I can't remember before age 3 in my childhood, even though it was me. So it's the same person.
I love that. And so, Stephen, if do you believe we're all, every single one of us, whether we believe it or not, do you believe that we are incarnate or reincarnated?
Yeah. And according to my spiritual studies, it's millions of times, not just thousands or hundreds. Yeah.
You said this last time. Well, how many did you say? I think you had it down to a number.
8.4 is what my guru said, I believe. 8.4 million human lives, and more in the lower kingdoms before that.
Have you studied anything like in what happens when you die? Like, did Mathew Whittier have the opportunity? Did you have the opportunity to come back as Stephen Sakellarios? Did you want to come so that you could keep his voice moving forward and his works being pushed forward?
I can guess that's what I feel, is that I reincarnated partly to restore that legacy. And the reason is that he realized that it was a mistake to stay hidden like that. Of course, he did it
Right,
partly for, because the pro-slavery people would be after him. But
right,
he also did it because I think that he felt that it was modest. that it would avoid the sin of pride. And I think Abby taught him that too. But what he
Right.
realized was that it's a mistake. You should go ahead, take credit for your work, not let it get to you, but also not let other people steal it. Because when other
Exactly
people
right.
steal it, they drag it through the mud, you know?
Right.
Yeah. And
And we have about 3 minutes, and when we come back, I do want you to talk about the most popular, most well-known poetry and poets, and where it came from, and it got stolen.
well, here's where my sanity comes into question. So this should be interesting. We can decide whether the career and the reputation and the sanity have all suffered. Yeah.
But this will be interesting. And so, again, you guys, thank you for joining us today. This is my first Facebook Live. Stephen, thank you. I call you my guinea pig.
Yeah.
But you can reach Stephen at IAL, that's in another life. That's what that stands for, in another life, IAL.goldthread, one word.com. And when we come back, we will go into some of the works that Stephen, you believe that were kind of plagiarized and stolen from uh, from Matthew.
It would take us all afternoon, but we'll get into some of the big ones.
Yeah, we'll do a couple because I want to get into your
Yeah.
relationship too with Abby.
Okay.
I think my listeners, my followers would really like that as well. So you all, thank you so much. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Beyond Proof Live on Facebook with my beautiful guest, Stephen Sakellarios. Hi, Stephen,
Hey.
the reincarnate of Mathew Franklin Whittier. And before break, I lied. We are going to get into we will get into the famous show, famous book, whatever, in a moment. But Stephen, I want to be very clear as well. And this is where I kind of wanted to go into the methodology that you have used and the stringent protocols you used on yourself to make sure that this was accurate and you could share it with the public. Can you go over that a little bit about how important it was for you to be accurate?
Yeah, I had studied, of course, Dr. Stevenson and Dr. Ramster and people like Captain Robert Snow, who was he was the head of homicide investigation for the city of Indianapolis, a professional detective, and a woman named Angela Grubbs, who was a research attorney. These people were professional investigators, either on the legal side or the scientific side. And I wanted to do my study to the same high standards and with the same methods. So it's very simple, really. What you want to do is you want to have an impression, a past life memory. You want to document it. You want to document it and date it in such a way that you can prove to people that you did, in fact, have that memory at that time. You can share it with other people. You can publish it online. That statement that I made about my past life in that interview, you can go to archive.org's Wayback Machine, put in her website, and you can see exactly what I said in 2003. So I couldn't have fudged it. This is the point.
I love
Then
that. Okay,
then
good.
once you've got these things documented and preferably publicly documented, then you go into the deep historical record where you could never have possibly run across the information before, and you find it and you prove that that what you said was correct. That's the ideal. And I was able to hit it a few times to beyond any reasonable doubt. I
Right.
have 4 or 5 that are so strong that I know it's a real case. That's what I wanted to do. The rest of them have to be seen in that context. We know it's a real case because I was able to prove it with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 memories. And the rest of them I can't prove quite as strongly, but they have to be seen in the context of these other ones that were proven. Okay, so that's basically the method.
So when you talk about the methodology, did you go through hypnosis or past life regression to get that first memory that you're talking about?
Some of them I did, and some of them I didn't. I used a mix. So I used hypnosis. I also used 2 psychic mediums. And then the rest of it was things that I was exposed to myself. What I did is I had a volunteer researcher working with me, and she would do research on Matthew, find some obscure thing. She'd send it to me in email, and I would react to it, either emotionally or intellectually or by, whatever reaction I had, I would share that. And then we'd go look for it to see if we could find it. So that was in normal waking consciousness. And
Oh, wow.
a lot of my study deals with, you know, what happens when you're exposed to something from your past life in normal waking consciousness. And people, this happens to people. There's stories of people who were driving through the country and all of a sudden they're like, wait a minute, I know this, I know this. And they know where the church is and they know how to get to, they know their way around and everything. So that has happened to people. The trick is to prove it.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So you're saying then once you get the nudge, once you learn from either mediumship or from past life regression or through hypnotherapy, there is that nudge that you get the little twinge, that little, because I've had this happen a couple of times. I have not researched it in the depth. So if I take little pieces, little segments, and just start documenting that. And then what do you do at that point? And this is for my followers and those who are watching, is I know that there are certain things that keep presenting every single life I come into. Can we go, and once we acknowledge that, Stephen, is it possible that we can overcome some of those issues if we just acknowledge where they've come from?
Well, yeah, acknowledging helps a little bit. Like, for example, I have some sore spots on my back, itching spots on my back, and I think that they came from being flogged in a lifetime on a
Oh,
ship.
wow.
But
Yeah.
I would, and knowing that, saying to myself intellectually, that was then and this is now, that was a different body, it helps a little. I think you'd really have to go through it.
Right.
You'd have to be brought through it in order to really cure it. That's my
Well, and
guess.
that's where
So,
Brian Weiss did with
right,
Catherine. I don't
right.
know how many, do you know how many? I don't even know how
I
many
don't.
years it took,
Yeah, I
but
don't.
her colleagues, friends, family had seen her kind of decline and
Yeah.
didn't, and there was no explanation for it.
Yeah,
And
no, you
so
can you can really cure some amazing things with past
I
life
think so.
therapy.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
once the person's really put through it, and realizes in a very deep emotional way. This is what I was going to say about these recognitions. For me, there were two conditions that had to be there in order for me to have what I would call a flashback. Flashback for me is just a brief vignette, always the same. It's just a brief glimpse, and it never changes. And I can never expand it to see what happened before, what happened after, or anything. It's just like a little piece of video. So
Right,
what has to be there is there has to be strong emotion connected with it.
right,
And whatever I'm presented with has to be almost exactly like it was.
right.
If I put
Okay.
myself in a strongly emotional situation from my past life, but I'm just on the physical piece of ground without anything there that's left, which is true in a lot of cases in Portland because they had a big fire here in 1866, I don't get
Right.
anything.
Oh,
If I go
interesting.
to something that's exactly the way it was, but there's no real emotion in it, I might get a little something. I can't really tell for sure. But if the two things are combined, you know, very often I'll get that flashback. I can
So
give a very quick example if we
yeah,
want.
yeah, but I was going to
Yeah.
ask, does this have something to do with empathy as well, where you have some people who are so empathetic? Does it have
I
anything? Do
don't
you
know
see a
because
correlation?
I have a sample size of one. This is a
Right,
pilot study. Yeah.
right,
This is crying out to be done by professionals.
right, right, right. Okay, so
Yeah.
go ahead. I did not mean to interrupt
So
you. So
real
give
quick,
us an
I was
example.
studying a newspaper, looking online on Google for a newspaper that I knew Mathew had been involved in, and amongst the other information was a picture. And this is George Bradburn, so we might want to put this up. When I looked at that picture, I had a vision. In my mind, he turned toward me, became alive. The picture came alive. He turned toward me, and a beautiful smile broke out on his face. And I felt typically I'll get a thought and a feeling. So my feeling was a very close friendship. And the thought was something like out of the 1800s, like a warm hearth on a cold day. That came
Wow.
into my mind. But I didn't know anything about this guy except that he had edited for that paper. That's all
Right.
I did not screen capture that information, but I know it didn't say anything about his relationship with Mathew. So, long story short, I found out later in a memorial that he had worked with Mathew as a co-worker among a small group of men for 14 years in the Boston Custom House. So, and they
Wow.
had all these things in common. They were abolitionists, they were spiritualists, they were deeply spiritual men. They both had a sarcastic sense of humor. So I can't 100% prove they were best friends, but it's pretty obvious they would have been for over 14 years.
Interesting. I
See,
love how you
so
find the breadcrumbs and follow them.
yeah,
That's
well, that
what
was
is
just,
so great.
yeah, I was just looking, I just kind of stumbled on it looking for this newspaper, but but that was pretty strong. It's pretty
So do
strong
you
evidence.
think, Stephen, do you think too, like if people have such a connection or a feeling from cities, like maybe they see it on television or in a movie, and it's just a really strong feeling, like one, I've been there before, and two, I feel home.
I think that reincarnation is a much, much bigger part of everybody's life than they realize. The only thing is you've got amnesia. That's it. You've got
Right,
all the emotions and your higher mind is working the same. The only thing is you don't have the memory. So it's just like a guy walking around with amnesia who's still the same guy,
right,
or woman. And
right,
I would say that you can't have that feeling unless reincarnation is involved. Not only that, I would say that you can't get you can't work up any interest in anything unless reincarnation was involved. If
right.
somebody's really into trains, like I work for an organization that runs an antique train, I would say every single one of the people that volunteers for that has had past lives where
Wow.
they love trains. No, except I mean, it's the only way you can get interested.
Right.
That's
No,
my
that's
take
that
on it.
nudge. I talk about that
Yeah,
nudge. Do you follow that nudge or do you just shut it up and quiet
yeah,
it down?
yeah.
So before a break, we only have about 3 minutes uh, before break, but I do want to get into what you had shared about your evidence that kind of proves that Matthew and his soulmate, Abby Poyen, were the original authors of A Christmas Carol.
Yeah, that came up gradually, except that in 2006, a year after I found Matthew, on my online blog, so this is public dated record, I said, I don't know where this fits in, but I'm going to say it just in case it ever means anything. I have a feeling that Matthew had something to do with the writing of A Christmas Carol. That's what I wrote in my blog in 2006, and then I forgot about it. You
Right.
know, and then quite some years later, I said, let's look at this, and I was scared to look at it because I thought, the dates are going to prove me wrong. You know, but the more I looked into it, the more obvious it was. And I looked deeper and deeper and deeper. And every time I looked deeper, it fit more strongly. For one thing, I found a letter that Dickens acknowledged from Matthew. So I know that they had contact.
Wow.
Then I found out that Matthew was personal friends with Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was like very much closely involved with bringing Dickens to Boston and having a big dinner for him. So Matthew was friends with him at that time. He definitely would have been invited. He definitely would have been introduced. So it went on and on and on. The more I looked, and it's so crazy that nobody will pay any attention to me. Nobody will even take it seriously for half a second. And yet I've got all of this evidence pointing to this thing, you know.
And we've got 2 minutes, Stephen. Can
Okay,
you
let,
hold
let me
okay, write that down.
real
Okay, say it. Go ahead. I just don't
real
I don't wanna
real
cut you
quick.
off. Yeah.
Dickens could not have written A Christmas Carol because there's real metaphysics in it, and he was a skeptic. He didn't believe in spiritualism or anything of that nature. He was a worldly man, and
Interesting.
there's real, authentic metaphysical principles in The Christmas Carol. He could not have written it.
Right.
No
Wow.
less than 6 weeks, which he claimed to have done.
Oh my gosh. Oh,
Yeah.
how
Okay.
interesting is that?
Yeah.
And I won't cut you off there, but I do wanna let's come back to that because I do wanna share I do want you to go into a little bit, and I'm trying to find where's my paper? Sorry, guys. Um If you go to Stephen's website, Stephen, I think that you've got I can't find it. I think you go back as far as 2001, your blog does,
Earlier.
right?
Yeah,
You
I
are
think
one
so.
of the most engaged. He documents everything. So you guys wanna know anything. It's almost 20 years? Like
Yeah, I started my
19
website
and a
in
half.
I started my website in 1998, so it's like almost
Wow.
almost before the internet, you know?
Oh,
Yeah.
so what he says, and there's so much data, you can go in and see every single time. I'm so proud of you for keeping a chronological order of what was going on. That's huge.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys, we are down to nothing. So when we come back, we're going to talk a little more about A Christmas Carol, if you don't mind, Stephen. You guys,
Love it.
thanks for joining us. First time live on Facebook. Thank you, Stephen. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Beyond Proof Live with me and my special guest, Stephen Sakellarios, where we are talking about everything reincarnation. And before we left, Stephen, I was kind of rushing you off because we were heading to break. Let's conclude the evidence, the things that you have noted about Matthew and his soulmate, who we'll get into in a moment, Abby, and their involvement in A Christmas Carol.
So what I think I might do, because I have so little time here, is just to run through the scenario, what I think happened.
Yes.
The evidence is too much. Um, so what I think happened is that Matthew and Abby were they were publishing a newspaper. They were running a school for writing, an evening school, and they had been basically run out of another town by their abolitionist views when they got discovered, and they'd gone back to another town closer to where Matthew used to live and she used to live, and they were getting persecuted there. I have plenty of evidence for that. There were like young women that were throwing stones at at the windows at night, apparently because they thought she was a witch, and against their anti-slavery views. So they were being persecuted. He decided he wanted to move the family. They had a little boy, 11 months old. He went to Michigan to try to get work. When he came back, he found that their little boy had died in a scarlet fever epidemic. They were forced to live in very poor conditions. Um, and I think they said they'd had enough. So they got an invitation to move temporarily to visit his second cousin, Richard Whittier, in Methuen, Massachusetts, right near Haverhill. And they stayed in this little farmhouse. This came up in my second psychic reading with a medium. He got, at the end of the session, he got Matthew's name, Mathew, and then he said Methuen. It wasn't real clear, but he said Matthew, and he coupled it with the name of that town. And I had no idea that Matthew had lived in that town. It took me quite a while to prove it. So it wasn't in my mind. He couldn't have read my mind. He was getting it from Abby. So when they were there, my understanding is from her, and also from memory, is that she was so devastated that she didn't want to live. And he was afraid she was going to kill herself. She would go for long walks along the river. He was scared she was going to throw herself in, or that she was just going to waste away. So he couldn't work. See, he had to stay with her
Right.
and watch her all the time. And what he came up with, he said he knew her deep desire to serve God and serve man with literature. She was a poetic genius from age 14, prodigy, and she also wrote short stories. So there's another short story of hers about Christmas. We have Abby's Christmas story image up here. That's an earlier story she'd written about Christmas. There's several precursors that each of them wrote. But he said if he could get her to write a story, the purpose of which was that if humanity read it, they would go through a conversion experience vicariously by identifying with this character. They were trying to transform the world. It was quite naive, but it was very Victorian. So their idea was they would write a story so powerful that the reader would identify with the main character, go through his conversion experience with him vicariously, and have a turning of the heart. That was the whole purpose. And she based that not only on, she was an esoteric Christian, but I think she'd also studied alchemy. So this is also high alchemy
Yes.
with set in, this is high alchemy set in Christmas. Okay,
Yes.
the
Love that.
original.
Yep.
Now,
Hmm.
Abby had studied esoteric things from age 14. I have poetry of hers that makes it very clear that she had a deep understanding of esoteric mystical studies, of astrology. She could palm reading. She was probably psychic. And all of this is these things are in A Christmas Carol. So in A Christmas Carol, you have earthbound spirits. You have karma, because Marley's ghost says, I wear the chains I forged in life. You have a life review, which is Scrooge being taken back. Abby was also very knowledgeable about psychology. So she was doing psychotherapy with Scrooge and a life review at the same time. Originally, I think the ghosts of Christmas past and future were really spirit guides. And then you have the personal transformations. Dickens could not possibly have written it. He knew nothing about any of this stuff. All he knew was ghost stories, and the stuff that he tried to write subsequently was all just fanciful. So he
Right.
couldn't possibly. Plus, if you read the ghosts' speeches, that's Abby's writing,
Wow.
and I have her writing elsewhere. You can compare it. That's
I was just
Abby.
going to say for those that are interested, where can they find Abby Poyen's writings?
Well, you read the Christmas Carol and you look where the ghost, where Marley's ghost speaks, where the ghost of Christmas Future speaks, and where it's deeply spiritual. That is Abby's writing. Dickens
Right.
messed with it a little bit, and you can find his draft, and you can see where he changed it. He even in the Ghost of Christmas Future, where she had the soul set free, he took the soul out.
Oh, interesting.
Nobody that wrote that kind of high
Right.
metaphysics would have done that.
Right.
Only
Right.
only a materialist who wanted to tone it down would have taken that out, you see.
Interesting.
So that's a nice little smoking gun in there for those that really understand what's going on. Matthew did the humor,
Right.
the puns, the plot, that was his specialty. So he did
Right.
all of that. All Dickens did was to stretch it out and dumb it down, as
Wow.
was my research says. He really didn't write it at all. So
Interesting. You're kind
that's the
of like a
story.
historian too. Do you
Well,
know that, Stephen?
I've written to every professor in United States, Canada, and Great Britain, in the UK, that I could find online who specialized in Dickens, and not a single one took me seriously. Most of them didn't
Wow.
write back. That's how strong, because it's just so crazy,
Well,
you know.
because if we do decide to go down this path, it has a potential to make us realize our whole life has been wrong,
Yeah,
that our
but we're
beliefs have
but
been
we're now
wrong.
learning that a lot of things have been wrong. This
Exactly.
is the time for that. Yeah. So that's Dickens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And we didn't get time this time. And Stephen, I'm so sorry because I do want to bring you back because I am so interested in the relationship with Matthew Franklin and Abby Poyen and how you're involved with that too.
Well,
And
they were real soulmates, so it's a
yes,
soulmate story. Yeah.
I love that. And what book can my readers or my followers go and read? It's the love story.
It's called Loving Abby in Truth and
Yes.
Spirit. Yeah.
Yes.
It's the story
And
written fairly early, but it's the story of our relationship today.
I love that. And Stephen, I want to take a moment and thank you so much for coming on my program. I try to offer a platform to give others a way that we can all start using our own resources, that we can find our own paths that give us just healing and understanding that what we've been taught sometimes is not all there is.
Well,
And
this is Abby's purpose, is to show people who have lost somebody, you can do this. You
yes,
can do this too.
right, and you
You
can
know.
do this too. And with that, happy holidays to you, to Matthew, to Abby, Stephen. Thank you so much, and to my followers, thank you so much for watching, for listening, and keeping an open mind. And Stephen, anything you'd like to say before we're done?
No, just Merry Christmas to everybody.
Merry Christmas. Thank you,
Okay.
everyone. Thank you, Nate, for a great show.